Hello and welcome. You're watching India Today. I'm Gaurav Sawant. Prime Minister Narendra Modi's word of advice to the G20 Foreign Ministers, a meeting that was attended by 27 foreign ministers and 2 ministers of state for foreign affairs. Multilateralism is facing a crisis. But the issue that we are raising here on India Today is the West holding the developing countries to ransom. What are the key takeaways? We'll discuss that in greater detail. I'm Gaurav Sawant. As always, let's get started with the headlines. India leads the global south at G20, says Ukraine war a make or break issue. Russia slams the hypocrisy of the West. External Affairs Minister Dr. Jaishankar and his Chinese counterpart hold talks on the LAC situation. Clear edge for the BJP in Tripura. BJP leads in 34 seats. Left and Congress lead in 14. Tirpa Mota leads in 11. Modi's victory lap at 7 p.m. in Delhi. BJP NDPP near 2/3 majority in Nagaland. BJP hopes to form government with NPP Meghalaya. There's a split verdict. Supreme Court orders SEBI probe on manipulation of stock prices in Adani Hindenburg case, says report to expert panel within 2 months. Adani welcomes the move, says truth shall prevail. Big Supreme Court verdict on appointment of Election Commission Chief, says CEC must be appointed like the CBI Chief. Panel of Prime Minister, Leader of Opposition in Parliament and the Chief Justice of India must appoint the CEC. Bulldozers roll into Prayagraj for the second straight day. Another house linked to Umesh Pal murder accused razed. The house belongs to gangster turned Neta Atiq Ahmed's key aide. Is the BJP moving forward on government formation in Meghalaya? The Chief Minister of Assam, Himant Biswa Sarma, has just tweeted that Conrad Sangma, Chief Minister of Meghalaya, called on Amit Shah, the Union Home Minister, and sought his support and blessings in forming the new government. So is the writing now very clearly on the ball? You have the numbers of Meghalaya right there on your television screen in Meghalaya. The Congress down to 5, NPP 25, BJP 4, others 25. 25 and 4. Is that the way forward? I quickly want to cut across to India Today's Preeti Chaudhary for more on this. Preeti, what does this mean?
Well, Gaurav, the latest that is coming in right now clearly seems to suggest that the BJP and the NPP are once again set to form government in Meghalaya after what has been a very acrimonious battle and a campaign where at one point of time Conrad Sangma didn't even allow the Prime Minister's helicopter to land, or to the Bharatiya Janata Party, calling the NPP corrupt, calling the NPP dynastic. But all of that clearly now in the past. A government is in order and Meghalaya is once again going to go with the BJP and the NPP combined with, in all probabilities, I would reckon Conrad Sangma as the Chief Minister. What is interesting here, Gaurav, is that as the numbers are now clearly firming up, 25 is what the NPP has wrapped up on, unprecedented in terms of even the NPP or Conrad Sangma would never have imagined that he'd be doing this well. So clearly by going solo, he's dug in his heels, he's done exceedingly well. Will this be a new chapter for the NPP where the Northeast is concerned as a party or a leader of the stature of Conrad Sangma, because he's gained a lot. If the party had not done well, it would have completely decimated Conrad Sangma, but this has taken him to an entirely different level. But having said that, Gaurav, you know what's interesting is I want to take you through the tweet by Himanta Biswa Sarma. Of course, Himanta Biswa Sarma on the 28th of February had met Conrad Sangma, and there was an understanding that if numbers come together, an alliance will be in order. And he's now tweeted out saying, Shri Conrad Sangma, Chief Minister of Meghalaya, called Amit Shah ji, who's the Home Minister, and sought his support and blessings in forming the new government. The operative word, Gaurav, is sought his support. That would mean right now the BJP is leading on 1 and 3 seats it has already won. So we are looking at least a support of 3, if not 4. They would still need about 2 more, or at least I would reckon, Himanta Biswa Sarma, who's managing the BJP affairs in the northeast, would be looking at a comfortable margin. So 25 of the NPP, they would need 5 for the halfway mark, 3 BJP is bringing, if not 4, so that comes to 29 if it is 4. They need 1 or 2. They will seek help from smaller parties. I don't think maybe the UDP, not this time around, because the UDP had come into support in 2018. It was NPP, UDP and the BJP. So let's see how this pans out. But one thing is for sure now, Gaurav, the BJP in whatever capacity, one in full strength in Tripura and now in Nagaland, with an alliance in Nagaland with the NDPP, but where it comes down to Meghalaya, now in alliance in Meghalaya as well. So in all 3 states, the BJP is going to be, if not the government, then a part of governance.
Keep tracking that story. I will come back to you for more. Preeti Chaudhary, for the moment, many thanks. So it's India's big moment at the G20. Of course, the summit is in September, but that the foreign ministers meeting, and this was extremely crucial. External Affairs Minister Dr. Jaishankar said 27 foreign ministers attended it. Of course, there were 2 ministers of state. As India hosts its first Big Bang G20 meeting, Prime Minister Narendra Modi had a video message for the G20 foreign ministers, and he called upon the G20 countries to build consensus on pressing global challenges and not allow their differences on geopolitical tensions to affect the overall cooperation. This, as the shadow of the Russia-Ukraine war looms large on the summit. Prime Minister Narendra Modi urged the foreign ministers to find common ground on divisive issues. Let there be more issues of commonality than divisions and build on that commonality. This, the External Affairs Minister said, was taking India's civilizational ethos forward. He warned that global governance so far, that architecture had failed on several key aspects. Multilateralism is facing a crisis. It's one of the biggest challenges that the world faces. Whether it's issues of preventing war, that's where multilateralism has not succeeded. The Prime Minister also said that issues of global south need attention. The world must focus on it. Let's listen in to Prime Minister Narendra Modi.
They are also the ones most affected by global warming caused by richer countries. This is why India's G20 presidency has tried to give a voice to the global south. No group can claim global leadership without listening to those most affected by its decisions. Excellencies, you are meeting at a time of deep global divisions. As Foreign Minister, it is but natural that your discussions are affected by the geopolitical tensions of the day. We all have our positions and our perspectives on how this tension should be resolved. Excellencies, we must all acknowledge that multilateralism is in crisis today. The architecture of global governance created after the Second World War was to serve 2 functions. First, to prevent future wars by balancing competing interests. Second, to foster international cooperation on issues of common interest. The experience of the last few years, financial crisis, climate change, pandemic, terrorism, and wars clearly shows that global governance has failed. We have seen stable economies suddenly overwhelmed by debt and financial crisis. These experiences clearly show the need for resilience in our societies, in our economies, in our healthcare systems, and in our infrastructure. The G20 has a critical role to play in finding the right balance between growth and efficiency on one hand and resilience on the other. We can reach this balance more easily by working together. That is why your meeting is important. I have full trust in your collective wisdom and ability. I am sure that today's meeting will be ambitious, inclusive, action-oriented, and will rise above differences. We must also admit that the tragic consequences of this failure are being faced most of all by the developing countries. After years of progress, we are at risk today of moving back on the sustainable development goals. Many developing countries are struggling with unsustainable debt while trying to ensure food and energy security for their people.
So the Prime Minister's emphasis was very clearly that the voice of Global South must be heard. But are the voices of Global South not being heard or being held hostage to the Russia-Ukraine conflict? Joining me on the broadcast is Ambassador Jaishankar, India's former ambassador to the United States of America, Ambassador Prabhu Dayal, and Ambassador V.V. Soni, India's former ambassador to Ukraine. Ambassador Jaishankar, the Prime Minister's advice to all the G20 foreign ministers was that the voice of Global South needs to be heard. According to you, ma'am, key takeaway, is the voice of Global South being ignored by the developed countries?
Well, I wouldn't say it's being ignored, but I think that divisions over Ukraine threatened to overwhelm the discussions in the G20, which were really not meant to deal with security or geopolitical issues. They were really supposed to focus on reviving sustainable economic growth, looking at sustainable development and climate change, looking at cooperation to address global pandemics. And there's a whole range of issues which were on the agenda of the G20 as priorities. And today we are seeing that the impact of the conflict in Ukraine has left economies, particularly in the developing world, reeling, trying to deal with the consequences of something that they had nothing to do with and are not really participating in. So fertilizer prices, food prices, energy prices, availability of energy, all these have become very serious issues for developing countries. If you look at South Asia itself, you can see economies collapsing all around. Sri Lanka today still has 50% inflation and is trying to negotiate a loan with the IMF to deal with its debt default which had taken place because they didn't have enough foreign exchange for their
And yet
import
the entire
requirements.
conversation from the Western countries, ma'am, appears to
Yes.
be focused around the Russia-Ukraine conflict. So Ambassador Prabhu Dayal, is the West trying to hold global South hostage to this Russia-Ukraine conflict? Is that what is happening?
No, I think that the Russia-Ukraine conflict is the elephant in the room. Nobody wants to talk about it, but at the same time, it can't be ignored because it impacts all aspects of the global economy. There is a shortage of food, of energy, there is global inflation, there are lower demands of goods and services, there is the falling economic growth in the developing countries. But the problem is that all these factors are being impacted by the Russia-Ukraine war. And that is why our Prime Minister had to emphasize that India's G20 presidency is for the global South. The problems of the global South have to be attended to, they have to be given due attention, and that the Russia-Ukraine war, which is so divisive, should not be allowed to take the focus away from these issues. So you're right that the Russia-Ukraine war is coming in the way. It is not something that the G20 should be dealing with, because the G20, as you pointed out, is an economic organization. But nonetheless, the situation is such that this war is having a very devastating effect on the global economy and in particular on the countries of the global South.
So are we to understand that unless the Russia-Ukraine war is addressed even on this platform, which isn't a security platform, it's an economic platform, came out of an economic crisis, is meant to address economic issues, but that political issue or that conflict issue, Ambassador V.V. Soni, will continue to hold the global South hostage? Where is that conversation about food security or energy security or sustainable development goals?
Well, it has been already brought out that the crisis has been hijacked because of a political agenda of the Western world. They want us to take sides on their issues which are of interest to them, but we are far removed from them and we have absolutely no control over the situation over there. So what is happening is, as a result of the conflict, all other issues get sidelined. Issues which are bread butter issues, issues which are of great importance and which must be addressed are pertaining to the global South. So India's attempt, therefore, is not to hijack the system, which is already taking a lot of time and energy and effort, and in fact is proving divisive. Issues at G20 should be a lot more global in nature. Now it's a regional conflict in terms, so far as we from the global South are concerned. But we are being asked to take side. Why should we take side? Because these are of no interest to us. They are not. I mean, they do not impact us except in a negative way, when all the attention, all the resources, and all the policies are diverted to settling those personal scores.
So from an economic platform then, Ambassador Jaishankar, has this now become a political boxing ring, and is it divided right down the middle? For example, there is the Western bloc and perhaps the Russia-China bloc, and India is also being asked to choose, take sides?
Well, I think India has to navigate very carefully and skillfully, and it did this in Bali. So you have a template which created a consensus to deal with a very divisive issue. Now both sides are, wanting to improve the Bali statement from their perspective, which makes it very divisive. I think if pragmatism is to prevail, then, you go back to the Bali template and put this issue aside and get on with the business of dealing with global challenges, which really are very serious at this point of time. To ignore them would be to do so at the peril of the peace and prosperity of the world. So, and it also risks actually G20 becoming either irrelevant or fragmenting in the long run if we don't want this to happen. And it's in the interest of all countries not to have it happen, because you can't have large economies outside the framework of the G20 and yet claim that it would have, you know, global significance or relevance.
Okay.
Then I think an effort has to be made from both sides.
But then, you know, the External Affairs Minister pointed that out, ma'am. And Ambassador Prabhudyal, if I could bring you in, sir, the External Affairs Minister pointed that out, that the two sides have taken such divergent views that it's unable, at least today, or even in the Finance Ministers' meet, they were unable to bridge the gap, bridge the divide. Does this appear then this will continue? Because a lot has changed since Bali. Russia and China seem to be going back even on the Bali declaration. And does this then mean no communique, just this consensus document? And what does this mean for the summit in September?
Well, you're absolutely right in saying that there has been a hardening of the positions of the two rival blocs. There was a consensus reached in Bali, and India had put in a lot of efforts for making that possible. But last week, when the G20 Finance Ministers meeting ended in Bangalore, there was no joint communique. This indicated that with the Russia-Ukraine war now having continued for over a year, the two sides, the United States and the Western countries on one side, Russia and China on the other, both these sides have hardened their positions, and therefore it will become very difficult to work out a joint communique. You are right in assessing that perhaps as we move on to the summit, the positions may harden even further. But of course, who knows what happens in global politics? Maybe there would be some resolution found to the war. Maybe it will end. But if it continues in this manner, and if the positions of the two rival sides continue to harden, then I think we are going in for very difficult times.
You know, because the Prime Minister's word of advice that multilateralism is under challenge. The architecture so far, Ambassador Soni, they haven't been able to prevent wars. They haven't even been able to address issues of food and energy security. So, despite that, despite the fact that 27 foreign ministers attended this foreign ministers meet, 2 ministers of state, there isn't a communique, there is a consensus document. Does this indicate India not succeeding in being able to navigate this minefield, or India tried? It's just that the positions are so hard, so be it.
Well, you see, there are 6 more months left for this summit. And the purpose of having these meetings at the level of foreign minister and, of course, finance ministers, etc., is to find a way out. How do we go? There are a lot of meetings on the sidelines. There are things which happen behind the scene. And that is exactly a tightrope walk which India has to undertake. And it has to undertake, and we must not give in. We still have 6 months. It's not going to be easy. In all likelihood, it may not succeed, but that doesn't mean that they should leave all the effort. I think India can possibly try to come up with some formula, some kind of a system, which a formula which can be acceptable to them. It has to continue. You cannot just give it up like this. Today, it looks little hopeless, but I would say that we must continue. The effort must continue.
Ambassador Shankar, did it look hopeless even to you? You know, when you heard the foreign minister's press conference, and before I come to that in just a moment, I want our viewers to listen in to what the External Affairs Minister said about the G20 conversations that were happening and the efforts made by India.
I met Minister Chingang on the sidelines of the conference this afternoon. It's our first meeting after he took over as foreign minister. We spent, I don't know, maybe about 45 minutes talking to each other. There are real problems in that relationship that need to be looked at, that need to be discussed very openly and candidly between us. That's what we sought to do today. We also had a brief discussion on what was happening in the G20 framework, but the thrust of the meeting was really on our bilateral relationship and the challenges in the bilateral relationship, especially that of peace and tranquility in the border areas.
Excellencies, let us remind ourselves that this grouping bears an exceptional responsibility. We first came together in the midst of a global crisis and are today, once again, actually confronting multiple ones. In considering these issues, we may not always be of one mind. In fact, there are some matters of sharp differences of opinions and views. Yet, we must find common ground and provide direction, because that is what the world expects of us. The world must also strive for more reliable and resilient supply chains. Recent experience has underlined the risks of being dependent on limited geographies.
Ambassador Jaishankar, is this your appreciation of the situation also, that even the G20 is now sharply divided, the Western Bloc and Russia, China on one side, and there is very little common ground on any issue because of Russia, Ukraine?
Yes, I think it is casting a shadow on the proceedings of the G20, and it would be in the interest of the world if the two sides could set aside their differences for the time being, or acknowledge them and keep them to a side, and try to find common ground on the global challenges which are of acute nature and which really are the primary concerns of the rest of the world.
But since that is not happening, Ambassador Dayal, what's the way forward? What's the road ahead? Because what happened at the finance ministers meet, when you're looking for more funds for energy security, for food security, for sustainable development goals, that doesn't seem to be happening either at the finance ministers meeting or the foreign ministers meeting. The entire focus of the West remains condemn Russia, the entire focus of Russia and China remains to stall this. What next then?
Well, our Prime Minister has given the best possible advice during his address today at the G20 Foreign Ministers meeting. He said that the divisive issues should be kept aside and the G20 should address the problems which it is supposed to address, that is the economic issues. He very categorically emphasized that the problems of the global south need attention, because in this entire scenario, the countries of the global south are suffering the most. And that is why he underlined that the presidency of India over the G20 will highlight the problems of the global south, and that perhaps is what needs to be done. On the other hand, if the world continues to be divided the way it is, and that is reflected in the G20 deliberations, then it will be difficult to find a way forward.
So is the G20 very clearly split wide open? Ambassador Soni, this is a grouping that was meant for economic development. It's now become a political or a diplomatic boxing ring?
Well, it is obvious that the split has taken place, but whether it's going to be permanent or is it just a temporary situation, as of now it doesn't look temporary, but it has to be brought home. The point has to be brought home to both sides. I mean, amount of aid which was earlier given by the Western countries on the one side, and by the Russians and the Chinese to the African countries and those in Asia. So both of them are affected. I mean, China's obligations have also gone up so much because of the, what is happening in our neighborhood. See Pakistan, see Sri Lanka. So that crisis is something which is going to affect not just the Western countries, but also to the Chinese and the Russians. So we have to convey the message across that it is nobody's interest. It's not in the interest of the developing world. It's not the interest of the southern world. It's not in the interest either of the developed world and also the Chinese world. So the message has to be given, and India is the only country whose voice will be listened, is that set aside your current differences. Let's get to the real issues involved, and as it was mentioned earlier, that those issues which divide us can be set aside at a later stage, and then we will deal with that.
But that's a message that India has been constantly giving, Ambassador Shankar. That message, neither America, nor Europe, nor Russia and China seem to be getting that message. Are we looking at this very dangerous hardening of stance, and is this then becoming Cold War 2.0?
Well, there is a hardening of stance because, with a Russian offensive due to take place in Ukraine, and Ukraine being armed with more sophisticated weapons and likely to have its own offensive, the conflict looks set to intensify over the next couple of months. But clearly, I think in diplomacy, we are used to patience and perseverance, and both are required at this stage, along with skill, to try to keep the focus on issues which are important. As Ambassador Soni said, there's quite some time till the summit. There'll be many other meetings, and hopefully by then we will be able to find a way to hammer out some consensus. So let's
very good advice, ma'am. I hope that better sense prevails. And a major development on the sidelines of the G20 Foreign Ministers meet. India, of course, is holding this biggest ever G20 Foreign Ministers meet. External Affairs Minister Dr. Jaishankar held a bilateral meeting with his Chinese counterpart, the first since Xi Jinping came back for a third term. Now, this bilateral meeting comes amidst an ongoing border tension between India and China at the line of actual control. And soon after this meeting, the External Affairs Minister talked about India reiterating its stance moving forward depended on peace and tranquility along the borders. Let's listen in to the External Affairs Minister.
I met Minister Chingang on the sidelines of the conference this afternoon. It's our first meeting after he took over as Foreign Minister. So we spent, I don't know, maybe about 45 minutes talking to each other. There are real problems in that relationship that need to be looked at, that need to be discussed very openly and candidly between us. That's what we sought to do today. We also had a brief discussion on what was happening in the G20 framework, but the thrust of the meeting was really on our bilateral relationship and the challenges in the bilateral relationship, especially that of peace and tranquility in the border areas.
Ambassador Dayal, how do you view this, the fact that the Chinese Foreign Minister came to India, of course, for the G20, but there was a bilateral, and India reiterated peace and tranquility at the borders, very essential. How would you view this?
Well, Gaurav, first of all, let me state that the India-China relationship is currently at its lowest point in 6 decades. Now, India and China have withdrawn troops from the 2 banks of the Pangong Lake, Gogra and Hot Springs. However, they have not been able to make progress in other crucial friction points such as Depsang and Demchok. Now, the Chinese side has been saying that these border tensions should be put aside or put away in an appropriate place while relations are taken forward in other areas such as trade. On our part, India has emphasized that the only disengagement of the frontline troops from the LAC and the restoration of peace and tranquility is what India wants. And India emphasizes that this alone can lead to the normalization of bilateral relations. So there is a big difference in the positions taken by the two sides, and in that context, this meeting between our External Affairs Minister and the Chinese Foreign Minister assumed a lot of significance.
Okay. Ambassador Soni, the fact that China and Russia would want India to perhaps not be in the Western camp when it comes to Russia, Ukraine, at the same time there's border tension between India and China. Where does that leave us and where does that leave China?
Well, first of all, China and Russia, if they think that India can be weaned away so easily, it can't be done like that. We have certainly empathy for Russia, but with China, to expect us to do anything on that, they have to take some steps. They haven't really taken any steps. As my colleague just now mentioned, this is the lowest point of our relationship with China because there is nothing moving forward. In fact, there is a hardening of position by their side on the border issues. There are certain issues which they agree on and they renege, they go back on that. So as Russia is concerned, I don't think we could have done more than what we have done for Russia. They have been a very good friend for us for the last decades. So we have not abandoned them. At the same time, we have also conveyed to them that the way forward is not just to take the stance which they have taken, which is very hardened stance. They have to realize the world has moved on. They can't possibly be guided by what was happening in the past. So they have to show some consideration, some kind of step forward. They have not done so far. So
which they haven't done so far. And India, of course, continues to maintain, and so does China, of course, more than 50,000 troops at the line of actual control. But at the G20, Russia hit out at the Western countries. The Russia-Ukraine conflict remained the biggest elephant in the room at the G20 Foreign Ministers meet. External Affairs Minister Dr. S. Jaishankar held a meeting with Sergei Lavrov, the Russian Foreign Minister. He is one of the key aides of Russian President Vladimir Putin, considered virtually his right-hand man. Now, in his briefing, Sergei Lavrov not only appreciated India's role, he spoke highly of Prime Minister Narendra Modi's role in governance amidst this Russia-Ukraine war, but he hit out at the Western Bloc. Lavrov claimed it was the West, especially the United States and the United Kingdom, who were trying to derail peace talks between Russia and Ukraine. Let's listen in.
You know, is the conflict impacting the global south? Of course it is. I mean, it's not something new. In fact, India has been saying this very strongly for pretty much close to a year, that you know, this is affecting. In fact, today in my own session, I actually used the word saying, for much of the global south, this is a make or break issue. That the costs of fuel, the cost of food, the cost of fertilizer, the availability of fertilizer, which means next year's food, these are all extremely pressing issues. And if you see some of the countries who were already struggling with debt, who were already impacted by the pandemic, for them, this conflict, the knock-on effects of this conflict coming on top of that, has been really, I mean, damaging is a very, very mild word.
Today, when addressing the participants of the foreign minister meeting, President Modi, I think he presented balanced and responsible position of the country as the president of the G20. And in this address, he was not just speaking about some isolated individual situations, because the West is trying to divide the geopolitical picture into individual episodes, but in the address by Mr. Modi, he gave the assessment of the situation across the globe.
So India continues to negotiate. India continues to be the voice of the global south, the developing countries, and let's see if the Western Bloc listens to developing countries on this very crucial aspect, whether it's energy security or food security or sustainable development goals. And we'll be tracking that story very closely. Ambassador Meera Shankar, Ambassador Prabhu Dayal and Ambassador V.V. Soni for joining me here on this India Today special. Many thanks.